We would like to welcome you to this joint webinar on behalf of the INCSR, RBAC, and the NCSR, all mouthfuls I know. Today we will be having the amazing guest speaker, Jess van Schalkwyk, with us. I will be speaking a little bit more to her background in a little bit. But before we jump in there, I know that some of the participants here today may be unfamiliar with the INCSR. You may have heard of RBAC and the National Consortium before. So I'm just going to start off with a little blurb on the newly formed INCSR and what it's all about. So the International Consortium for Societal Resilience was formed this year, and it's a global network that basically aims to bring together different partners from around the world who all focus on societal resilience in different forms. It was formed as part of the National Consortium for Societal Resilience and is basically an extension of that network where different members from around the world can share learnings and resources with each other in order to support society. The INCSR now has an international collection of members from more than 17 countries, which is brilliant, and we are always looking to expand that footprint. So with that in mind, if you are interested in finding out more about the INCSR, please do follow us on LinkedIn. The incredible Andrew will be popping the link into the chat now, so you're more than welcome to follow that as we go along. You can also email the email here on screen if you would like to find out more, or if you would like to suggest another guest speaker who could present in the same manner that Jess will be presenting today and doing a deep dive into a topic that would benefit the broader community. Okay, so without further ado,
Dom, just to let you know to share the slides.
Oh, I thought they were up. Andrew, are they visible now?
They are, yes.
Thank you so much. So everyone, the email address I was referring to earlier is visible over here. And I'm sure Andrew has popped the link to the INCSR website as well as the LinkedIn page into the chat. So we would like to welcome you again, especially all the late entries to this webinar today, which will be focusing on localizing resilience. And Jess is going to be speaking to us about how we can rethink community-led disaster management. My name is Dominique Binns, and I am one of the team members on the INCSR team. We would really like to give you a warm welcome today. We know you are all very busy and have lots of things to do. So we would like to take the time to thank you for making it here today, whether you are live with us or watching this recording. It is being recorded and it will be made available to watch later. You will receive the link to this recording, which will probably be on YouTube after this event. I will be introducing our lovely guest speaker in a little bit, and I will also be moderating the QA later. You are more than welcome to make use of the Q&A function, as well as the team chat. Later on, we will also give you the opportunity to raise your hand if you would like to verbalize your comment or your question for Jess. And all of your mics and cameras are automatically switched off. However, later, if you would like to raise your hand and ask a question, we will give you the chance to turn on your mic and turn on your camera. Our agenda today is rather straightforward. We are starting off with a brief welcome and introduction, which I am in the middle of. And we will then jump over to our wonderful guest speaker, Jess van Schalkwyk from Disaster Nomad, who will be taking us through today's topic. Now, just by way of introduction, Jess van Schalkwyk is the founder and managing director of Disaster Nomad, which is a South African-based consultancy that helps organizations around the world strengthen disaster risk management and resilience, primarily through locally led approaches. So she is the perfect person to speak to today's topic. Jess has worked across more than 17 global deployments in the humanitarian and disaster risk sectors, from emergency response and recovery to long-term resilience building. Jess brings a wealth of technical experience in community-centered risk assessments, localization strategy, disaster comms, response and recovery, and system strengthening. She has worked with several international NGOs that specialize in response, recovery, and resilience. And she has also served as an assistant director for risk and vulnerability at the Western Cape Provincial Disaster Management Centre here in South Africa. Today, Jess leads multiple stakeholder projects through Disaster Nomad with organizations like UNICEF, Save the Children, All Hands on Hearts, Baytree, and IBEX Ideas. A key part of her work involves advancing locally led approaches in the disaster continuum. Jess believes in meaningful, actionable localization, not just as a policy commitment, but as a practice grounded in equity, empathy, and sustainability. As a close friend of Jess, I can tell you that this is not merely lip service. She is truly passionate about this topic and is certainly leading the charge when it comes to localization in her work, but also in her personal life, which is always fantastic to see. Okay, so without further ado, Jess, I would like to invite you to share your screen. And we are just going to have a little bit of a tech fumble over here whilst we do that.
All right, can I just check and make sure is everything sharing from my side?
Hi, Jess. Yeah, I can see that.
Awesome. All right, well, first of all, Dom, thank you so much. And Andrew and Duncan, thank you for the invite. I am really freaking excited to be here today. And it's a huge honor and privilege to be able to present. And thank you so much to everyone who has joined. As Dom has mentioned, this is a huge passion project for me, the localization space. It's something that I think is hugely important, and I really hope that today everyone on the call takes something away that they're able to use in their day to day. It is no secret that we are at a really pivotal time globally, and disasters are increasing in frequency, severity, and complexity, and they're also intersecting with climate volatility, urbanization, inequality, and pretty fragile governance systems. And yet for all the sophistication of international frameworks and global coordination platforms that we have, there seems to be this one truth that remains, and that is a constant, and that is that the people closest to the risks are the people closest to the solutions. When I started my career over 10 years ago, I came out of my honors degree, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and super excited about everything. And I think, like many of us in the humanitarian space, you know, we want to save the day. And I was going to help people. And I just, you know, I had grand ideas of what that would look like. And I went on my first deployment with the organization I first worked for. And we were working in Madagascar following one of the cyclones that had hit there. And I sat down with our operations director, you know, the annoying, fresh out of university student that I was. And I said, how do I be the best disaster manager I can be? What can I do? And he gave me the most jarring, but the best advice I think I've ever received in my career. Just shut up. And I kind of looked at him with these enormous eyes until he started to explain what he meant. And he said to me, Jess, if there's one thing he's learned in his extensive career, it's that if you just stop and listen to the people who live in these communities, the people who live these experiences day to day, odds are the answers are going to find you. You don't need to come up with the answers. And that really set my career on a trajectory of looking at, well, what does this mean for the space that I had spent so much time studying and learning about? And there's two examples that really stand out to me that keep bringing me back to this concept of localization. The first was when I was on a deployment in the US Virgin Islands, and it was following Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And as we flew in, coming in over the islands, they were decimated. They had been taken out by these hurricanes that had come through, and you land in this devastation, and we get in the cars and we're heading across to our base. And I remember looking up on the cliffside or on the hillside, and there were these little round structures. We had passed these megalith hotels that had been flattened. And it just was such a stark contrast. I was like, how are they standing? And I asked the guy that was with us, I was like, what is the story here? And what he'd explained is the US Virgin Islands have got a pretty dark history when it comes to slavery. But what also happened is that people that had moved from Africa had brought a lot of their African traditions and African culture with them. And the traditional African rondavel is built as a round structure. And this is something that those communities had brought with them. And when these hurricanes came through, the storms went past them because there were no corners on those structures. And so there was nothing for the wind to grab onto. And sure, some of them had lost their roofs, but the majority of those structures stood true. The second story that I still laugh about frequently was a colleague of mine when I was working in the government center told the story about how his grandmother knew that the day zero drought was going to hit the Western Cape province of South Africa before the meteorologists did. And we all used to look at him and kind of roll our eyes. And what he explained is that his grandmother had always been taught that the ants disappear when a drought is coming. It was something that had been passed down in their family as this information. And when you go and you look at the science behind it, ants are incredible environmental indicators. And a lot of the time what they do is they sense these atmospheric pressure changes or changes in the environment, and they adapt accordingly. And so what happens is that the ants sometimes go deeper underground in search of water and to protect their nests. And this is information that has been passed down. And I know that we're venturing into more of the realm of indigenous knowledge. But at the end of the day, I don't think we can talk about localization without understanding the power that lies in indigenous knowledge and what that means to the disaster management continuum. So these are just examples, but they also speak to something far bigger. Local residents are first to respond, they are last to leave, and they are the only actors with a lifelong stake in the resilience of their communities. But despite decades of rhetoric around community, quote unquote, empowerment, a word that I hate, and localization, these same communities are still too often positioned at the end of the decision-making chain rather than at the forefront. And so today I want to explore why truly localized and co-created disaster management is not only ethically necessary, but it's strategically essential in resilience building, and how we can operationalize it in ways that strengthen resilience rather than simply rebranding these traditional power structures. And so today what I'm going to do is examine what localization and co-creation really mean, why they are essential for resilience, how to move from rhetoric into real practice. I'm going to go through a couple of practical examples and some evidences, and then also implications for INGOs, volunteer organizations, government, academics, and donors. So I think a good place to start in all of this is with some good old-fashioned terminology and what localization is. So the push for localization emerged most notably after the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, where the grand bargain was established and aimed to channel 25% of humanitarian funding directly to local actors and enhance the role of local organizations in crisis response. Localization is broadly recognized as this process of ensuring that local actors, so local government, CBOs, traditional stakeholders, traditional structures, local responders, that they have the decision-making power and the resources and capacity and accountability within humanitarian action. And the shift represents this commitment to making humanitarian action as local as possible and as international as necessary, which is something that has also been coined by the Red Cross. I know that there are also discussions around is this term still appropriate? So we've discussed localization in its simplest form is referring to this shifting power, resources, leadership to local actors, sorry. But co-creation is also seen to advance this by requiring shared design, shared decision-making, and shared accountability across all stakeholders. It's not about outsourcing risk to local actors without resourcing them. It's also not tokenistic consultation after these decisions have already been made. And it's definitely not contracting local partners only as implementers and not as the agenda setters themselves. So yes, there are some who argue against the term localization. And in recent years, there has been this growing body of practitioners and academics that has questioned whether the term localization meaningfully advances the shift in power it was intended to describe in the first place. So while localization emerged from global humanitarian reform, critics do argue that the term itself is inherently maintaining this center to periphery dynamic. So in other words, localization assumes there is a default center of power and that it needs to be shifted outwards, typically from international or Western institutions to the so-called local. And this framing risks reinforcing this hierarchical structure that localization was always intended to disrupt. So positioning local actors as recipients of transferred power rather than the legitimate holders of that in their own right. Localization has also been criticized for becoming a policy buzzword without structural transformation. It's been adopted widely in strategy documents, and while real funding, authority, and agenda setting power and accountability mechanisms do remain centralized, this is the problem that is being seen. And so several scholars highlighted that localization efforts risk devolving responsibility without resources and placing pressure on local actors to lead without shifting budgetary control or removing the donor-driven compliance burdens. And so as a result, localization may unintentionally create dependency. Another critique is that localization can oversimplify the diverse ecosystem of actors within communities. And it's important to also note that that term local, it's not a homogeneous unit. And there are power imbalances that also exist within communities. And so some argue that localizing humanitarian action without acknowledging those internal power structures risks, again, reinforcing exclusion. And so in response to these limitations, many thought leaders have advocated for shifting the language from localization to co-creation or co-leadership or locally led humanitarian action. And the term co-creation reframes the process, not as transferred from one entity to another, but as a shared, iterative, and equitable partnership model. So instead of decentralizing power from this so-called center, it assumes that there's multiple centers of knowledge and legitimacy. It also aligns more closely with concepts in resilience theory and systems thinking and participatory governance, which emphasize emergent solutions built through collective intelligence. So rather than moving international power down to communities, co-creation prioritizes this kind of horizontal collaboration and mutual accountability. And this approach focuses less on where the power sits and more on how relationships and decisions and resources are structured. So shifting to co-creation acknowledges that resilience is not delivered by external actors. It is grown through social cohesion and community-driven systems. And for many, the language co-creation is more honest and aligned with decolonial thinking. So for me, while co-creation is said to reframe resilience as something built with communities and not delivered to them, meaningful localization is power conscious, capability building, and long-term. And it's ultimately rooted in trust. And I think we do often get caught in the weeds of jargon that's used in our sector. And please don't get me wrong. I believe that words carry a lot of weight, and there are terms that we should and we shouldn't be using. But there's still a lot to be unpacked by sector experts before we see a universal shift to a new way of framing localization or co-creation. And so during the presentation today, I am going to still use the term localization, but I'm aware that a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, we might be using a very different term. And my concern is more with the intention behind these words and what they represent. My concern is with ensuring that we are appropriately supporting the communities that we intend to serve. Which brings me to the why now question. So it has obviously been around for a while, this concept of localization, but there are a few things that have really emphasized and pushed this into the spotlight. The first being, everyone's favorite, the COVID-19 pandemic. But this really exposed the limitations of traditional humanitarian systems, where we saw international organizations that were unable to respond when disasters were occurring during that time. And so we saw a lot more local actors that were stepping into that place and able to respond a lot quicker. There's also the increasing frequency and intensity of disasters. And this means that organizations need to work with actors who can respond quickly and effectively without depending on international support. And this is largely to do with climate change. A lot of these disasters we're talking about, but it is not exclusive to that. And lastly, we've also seen these global movements that are emphasizing decolonization, anti-racism, and equity. And these have reinforced the importance of advocating for community decisions and interventions, and making localization a practical and an ethical imperative. So we often frame localization as this moral responsibility, and it absolutely is. It speaks to justice and dignity and the belief that people have the right to lead decisions that affect their lives. But equally, localization is an operational necessity and a really big strategic advantage in disaster management. It makes humanitarian action faster, smarter, and ultimately a lot more sustainable. And research and field experience have consistently demonstrated that localization produces measurable gains across all stages of disaster risk management. So what we've seen is that it accelerates response, and I alluded to this previously, where local actors are already on the ground when crises strike. They can mobilize within minutes and not days, and because they know the terrain and the language and the community systems, it's a far more efficient process. It also improves relevance and cultural fit. And localization ensures that interventions reflect the lived realities rather than these external imported programmatic templates. And so, for example, communities are far more likely to maintain an early warning system or evacuation routes if they've co-designed those. It also strengthens legitimacy and trust. And during a crisis, trust is currency. Legitimacy often comes from people trusting those that they know and they share their experience with, and those who remain there long after media teams and everyone else has left. It also turns every response into a training ground for long-term resilience. And it's not just this quick fix in and out, but it's an opportunity to build enduring capabilities. And localization also helps with enhancing sustainability. So local ownership ensures that systems evolve beyond these project life cycles. And when communities define success and hold accountability, resilience becomes self-reinforcing. Local actors are the only actors that are there before, during, and after a crisis. And their knowledge of the social networks and livelihoods and their own vulnerabilities is cumulative and it's generational. And if we think about the ants that I spoke about, it's a big part of it. Ultimately, community members are that that connective tissue that maintains the continuity across disaster phases. And so during preparedness, it strengthens awareness and readiness and collective memory. During response, it helps with delivering rapid, contextually accurate action. In recovery, it's embedding cultural legitimacy and social trust, and in long-term resilience, it cultivates self-sufficiency and adaptive governance. And when communities lead, response time is measured so much shorter than these days or weeks. And when communities co-design, interventions reflect lived realities and not these assumptions from you and I who are not part of the community. Ultimately, when communities are owning their own recovery, resilience extends beyond these project life cycles that we are so used to. But, and there is a big but here, I want you to think about if you were to break an arm or a leg or to get a really deep laceration and you went to your doctor and you say, "Doctor, there's a problem and I need you to help me here." And the doctor hands you the sutures and says, "Here you go, stitch it yourself." That in many ways is what is now happening when we talk about localization. And if we liken it to the community and the NGO space, we've swung the pendulum from one side to the other. And we've gone, okay, INGOs shouldn't be involved or NGOs shouldn't be involved. It needs to be the community. Here you go, you do it. And we haven't allowed for that transition to take place where we need to be asking the questions. Of course, it needs to be informed by communities, but we have to ask the questions and say, great, but what do you need from us? How can we help? What can we bring? Is it funding? Is it support of resources in other ways? Is it skills? Is it experiences? What is it? How do we support that and work together? Because I'm pretty sure if you went to the doctor and you just lay in the bed and you expected him to figure out the problem, it's going to take a whole lot longer than if you were to speak to the doctor and kind of, this shared mutual development of a solution. And that is where we need to go, to a place where we are collaborating, but allowing communities to really be the drivers and the owners of it. And despite the momentum that was created by the Grand Bargain and the humanitarian system, trying to shift in this direction, we continue to struggle with implementation of it. We have frameworks and declarations and pledges coming out of our ears, and yet on the ground, the way power and resources flow has changed very little. And for me, the big question is, if localization is so obviously beneficial, why do we remain stuck? And I think that there are a few systemic reasons behind this. The first is the donor and institutional accountability structures. At the heart of the problem lies the system built around control rather than collaboration. And donor compliance frameworks still channel the majority of funds through international intermediaries. And in 2022, there was only about 1.2% of global humanitarian funding that went directly to local and national actors. And so this means that decision-making and risk management and even program design remain centralized and often in global capitals that are far removed from these crisis contexts. And so this results in structural contradiction. We talk about localization, but we continue to fund internationalization. The next one for me is risk aversion. And many international actors express this genuine support for localization, but they're hesitant to act because of this perceived risk. There is a deep institutional fear of reputational loss and mismanagement or inefficiency of funds, and decisions to shift funds to actors that are perceived as quote unquote less accountable. And this is highly problematic in terms of the narrative. It's based on this unequal standard and assumes that communities are less accountable. And yet organizations kind of get away with it because they're afforded this grace of it's a complex context that you're working in. And there's a practitioner that once famously said, and I cannot remember their name right now, but they said, we trust local actors to save lives when the cyclone hits, but not to manage a budget when the sky is clear. And that really sums that up for me. The next point is on short project cycles. And most humanitarian and development programs operate on pretty short-term funding windows, and they are far too short to build capacity and institutional continuity. Capacity strengthening and relationship building and trust, they take time. And so the quick demands of things are not allowing for localization to take place. Long-term resilience requires these long-term partnerships that are not project by project transitions. We also see this external expertise bias. Apologies. Thank you. This external expertise bias. And that is a persistent bias that still defines whose knowledge counts, which is a stupid concept. And many global organizations operate under this assumption that technical expertise flows from the global north to the global south. And this creates such a paradox. Local knowledge, traditional risk mapping, social networks, cultural early warning systems, the ants, is often dismissed as anecdotal. But external models are evidence-based, and they're given all this huge credit. But history shows us that community knowledge consistently fills those gaps when these outside systems fail. Lastly is volunteer and NGO-driven operating models. And many organizations, including volunteer-powered ones, are designed around these deployment-based operating models. So you're mobilizing teams and they're moving into disaster regions. And this is really useful when you need to do a surge response. But these models can unintentionally sideline community leadership by embedding external coordination as the norm. And so to localize, these organizations have to evolve. And there are so many organizations that are doing this, that are looking at how can we change the way that we're doing things. And I'm really not here to bash what is being done. There is some really amazing work that is happening. And many organizations sincerely believe that they are localizing. But what we're seeing in practice is that they're essentially delegating implementation and not authority. And this distinction is what matters. We can't build resilience by completely bypassing the systems that are going to have to sustain them moving forward. True localization is about embedding resilience into those local systems, social, political, economic. It's not building parallel structures that when funding or support leaves, collapse. And so this brings me to this link between localization, co-creation, and resilience. If localization is going to move from rhetoric into the real world, the humanitarian system is going to have to fundamentally shift. It's got to move from a model of delivery to one of support and enablement. And for decades, humanitarian effectiveness has been measured by how much we deliver. So the number of shelters that we build, the number of food parcels that we distribute, the number of volunteers deployed. But true resilience doesn't come from the scale of delivery. It comes from the depth of the capacity that is built within local systems and supported. And localization in practice is really about transitioning from this idea of doing things for community to doing things in support of what communities need, and ultimately supporting communities in what they are already doing themselves. There are some core principles that apply for locally led resilience. So community defined priorities. We've spoken already about this, but making sure that communities are defining what resilience means to them, and that in support of that, we can come in and be led by what it is that they need. It's also investing in local governance systems, so not building those parallel structures. It is resourcing local institutions, so not only funding the deployments when something happens, but also before something happens, supporting those local institutions with finance, human capital, additional resources, and knowledge partnership. So valuing that local or indigenous knowledge and experience and contextual intelligence, and not just dismissing it as anecdotal. And one for me that is, I think you're going to eat a bit of humble pie with this one, but the multi-directional learning that international actors have to adapt to. It's not about us transferring capacity in one direction and saying, here, we're here to provide resource or knowledge, but we ourselves have to be willing to adapt to the frameworks and the metrics and the timelines based on community realities and understanding that we ourselves have to learn as well. So localization is not this activity. It needs to be a governance approach. It builds resilience by embedding risk reduction and preparedness and recovery into society and the systems that communities already rely on. There was research done by UNDRR, the Global Assessment Report, that emphasizes that resilience can't be imported. It must be locally manufactured. And localization is not a policy choice. It's this precondition for resilience. And so the more ownership a community has over its preparedness, the less dependent it becomes on external interventions and the more enduring the recovery and adaptive systems become. So when I look at it, for me, localization is this bridge between immediate response and long-term resilience. And it transforms humanitarian action from this ongoing cycle of relief aid to rather a continuum of resilience and building that. So this is where I want to move on to what this can look like in practice. And these examples, some of them are ones that I have really been inspired by, and some of them that I've had the privilege of being a part of. The first one is volcano and cyclone recovery in Vanuatu. And following, it was kind of a multi-mix of disaster events, but there were local churches and women's groups that led recovery efforts. So shelter planning, needs assessment, recovery coordination. And this allowed for a much faster response and a much more targeted response within the area. And because the planning and implementation were rooted in local structures, the recovery timeline was faster and better matched the cultural and infrastructural contexts. Ownership by the local groups also improved, and this ultimately improved legitimacy. And again, this illustrates how localization and co-creation, so this illustrates localization and co-creation. So local actors leading and designing, international actors enabling, rather than the reverse. The next example is around health and epidemic readiness in Sierra Leone. And following the Ebola outbreak, what's happened there is that we've started to see community surveillance committees rather than only these external agencies that are surveying what is going on. You've got the community involved in that. And that has led to much faster reporting of outbreaks of other health events such as cholera and far greater preparedness. We've also seen in Kenya drought preparedness, where pastoral communities have co-designed drought triggers with government. And this has resulted in a much faster social safety net and more adaptive resilience. And because the local communities were engaged in co-designing the triggers and the response mechanisms, activation has been faster and legitimacy has been higher, and the local adaptation has been a lot stronger. Moving on to some other cases that are a little closer to home for me. The first is the female mason training done in Nepal with an organization, shifting screens here, with an organization called All Hands and Hearts. And it's an organization I spent a lot of time working with. And they developed this female mason training program because there was a need that was identified with the community, saying that for a lot of the communities following earthquakes that had happened, men leave communities to go in search of work, and it left a lot of the female residents at home. And they really were looking for ways to make money, but also to rebuild their communities. And so this female mason training program was started, which allows women to become brick masons. And so in future, when earthquakes occur, they are able to be part of the solution of rebuilding what has happened in their communities. Within Peru, we also did a response there following the landslides that had happened, and going in with an assumption of what would be needed. There was an assumption of, all right, we got to go in and rebuild homes. But working with the community, what was identified was there was actually this desire for a community center, a place where people could come together. And that saw a reprioritization of what needed to be done in the community first. And that led to a safe space for children to come during the day when parents needed to go and find work, and providing that kind of sense of normalcy again in the community, so that recovery process could be a lot smoother, and a lot, I don't want to say a lot more comfortable. It's not a comfortable situation, but it provides a familiarity, which is also important from a psychological perspective in that recovery process. And the last one that I want to move on to is very close to home for me right now, South Africa. And I have been working in the Langa community in the Western Cape. So the Langa community is a settlement that is the oldest settlement in South Africa. And I've had the privilege of working with an organization called Community Risk Management, who have been looking at how do we bring risk management into this area and allow for communities to play a bigger part of it. Over the last few months, we've done surveys and we've heard from them, what is it that they need? And this really sparked for me a want to learn more, and really kind of drove me in the direction that my master's working paper has gone. And so what I've been doing over the last few months is exploring how we can create a model or a system that better supports community-based organizations and better supports communities in managing disaster events that's really powered through localization. And so what I have been doing is creating this model that started with literature and document reviews, and looking extensively at what is happening globally, what are people saying right now, and consolidating that into a literature-based framework. That has been taken to this Langa community, and we had some really incredible focus group sessions with the community, but also with community-based organizations, hearing from them what the challenges are when it comes specifically focusing on fire, but what are the challenges in terms of them preparing for fires or responding to fires, and importantly asking them about this structure. What is being said globally, does it match up with the lived reality? And what really just inspired me was the level of excitement that was seen by these community members in saying, yes, this is what we want. We want to have a way for us to be a part of our own resilience building. We want to have a voice, we want to have a structure, and they've of course always got a voice, but it's about creating an environment that ensures communities are placed at the front of that. And so this research journey that I've been on has been really enlightening for me as well, and challenged a lot of my preconceived notions around what localization is. And hopefully once this model is finalized and is made available, is something that will be able to support localization in other areas. It's a model that's been kind of focused down on preparedness and on fires specifically for scope of research, but with the intention of it being able to expand into other areas and other parts of the disaster continuum. And these all just really illustrate, all of these examples illustrate this shift that is happening and that needs to happen, of projects being delivered to communities, rather shifting it to projects and systems being built with communities. So what needs to change? We have talked about how localization matters, how it strengthens resilience, and where it is already working. But if we truly want to transform the system, we need to operationalize it. And so this means shifting how we fund, how we govern, how we build capacity, and how we measure success. But I think most importantly, it's about shifting how we think. And so at the top of that list is funding. We need more flexible funding structures. We need funding moving closer to the community-based organizations, and better financing pathways. At the heart of localization is really the question of who holds the money and who decides how to spend it, which is pretty callous to say, but it is the honest truth of a lot of how these operations take place. There's also governance, so shared decision-making and accountability platforms. And localization fails when governance remains top-down. Shared governance doesn't mean international actors disappear. It means we co-create leadership spaces. We then also have capability, so this dual pathway training for local and international actors. And we often frame it as building local capacity, but that's really, if half the story, that's a lot. To truly localize, we need to de-institutionalize international dependency by training both sides to collaborate differently. And then we have measurement, so community-defined resilience and resilience indicators. And our current monitoring frameworks are often shaped by donor logic, so short-term, output-focused, and externally defined. And yet resilience is deeply contextual. A community's progress may not show in our Excels, our spreadsheets, our documents, but in social cohesion, and in the confidence of leaders, and in the revival or the support of traditional knowledge. And then we have mindset shift. And this is, again, a humble pie one, of moving from saviorism to solidarity and getting away from the delivery of aid to this co-creation. And I think this is probably the hardest shift for all of us. And it's I almost want to say a cultural shift in our space. Localization is not about doing less. It's about us doing differently. It's about acting as partners and not as these so-called providers. And it requires a lot of humility, and a lot of empathy, and the willingness to let go of control, which I know for myself, I like control. I like being in control of things. But in this instance, it really is just about letting go of it. It's the difference between us helping people and working with people, and us becoming active partners in the situation. So in essence, localization is not about us stepping back, but rather about creating this space for local leadership. And for me, the future of effectiveness in humanitarian work is not international actors doing less. Like I said, it's about actors doing a lot differently to what we have been doing before. So if we want to think about resilience as the destination, local leadership is the vehicle that's going to get us there. The future of disaster governance depends on our ability to rebalance notions of power, and experience, and for us to build with communities and not for communities. And what I've spoken about today is not about doing the right thing. It's the only approach, actually, that's going to allow us to meet the complexity and the scale of the challenges that lie ahead of us. I started off by saying disasters are increasing in frequency and severity, but globally we are seeing an increase in disruption and crisis. And so we need to find a way to navigate that. Resilience grows from agency and ownership and dignity. And it's not charity and it's not symbolism. It is strategic and it's necessary. And in many instances, we've seen that it is a proven solution. So communities don't lack capacity. I want to drive that home. What we are seeing right now is that they lack access to power and platforms and resources. And our task is not to build resilience for those communities, it's to build the space and the trust and the systems for communities to lead resilience themselves. Because what we see is when communities lead, they recover faster. Development is fairer, and resilience, real resilience, is enduring. And so for me, it's not really a question of whether we should localize or co-create. The question is whether we are ready to do what localism demands of us. Localization demands of us. And that is to listen, to share, to let go, to build space and trust and capacity, and probably just to shut up. So with that, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to say thank you so much for the time. And if you have questions, I welcome those. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jess. We have had quite a few comments in the chat as you've been talking. Just for everyone's knowledge, we will now be moving into the question and answer portion of today's session. We have about 30 minutes to dedicate to this before we close with some announcements from INCSR side. Please do pop your chats either into the comment section if you haven't done so already, or you will see on the top of your Teams panel, there is a Q&A option where you can actually directly input the question that you have. I will also give everyone a chance to, well, not everyone, but a few people a chance to raise their hand and to verbalize a question. So please do give some thought to anything you want to ask Jess whilst we have her. I am going to, Jess, I'm going to pose some questions to you from the floor in the meantime. The first one is from Lily Sharp, and she asks, what does resilience mean to you?
Sorry about that, lost the microphone. Thank you for the question, Lily. I always love this question because it opens up some really heated debates with people, which is always fun. And I think for many people, resilience means many things. When I think of resilience, what it means to me is it's autonomy, it's independence, and it's the ability to bounce back from situations when out of the ordinary circumstances occur. So thinking about a community, if we're thinking about a disaster event, a resilient community to me is one that, yes, they're going to be disrupted in the immediate, but the way that they're able to bounce back from that, it's you kind of just shake it off and keep going. And it's also being able to do that without feeling like you need to sit and wait for someone to come in and save you. We've spoken about that. There's this narrative around people coming in to save. And so for me, resilience is really this independence of, I know that I can bounce back from something when it does happen, and it just becomes part of the fiber of your being.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Jess. The next question is from, I believe, Jose Molnade. How do professionals community leaders find a balance between valuing local knowledge at the same time as pushing against false narratives in communities? For example, we see many issues with anti-vaccine movements, especially during COVID, which some could claim are local knowledge or lived experience. Before I hand over to Jess to answer, I do want to remind everyone that the recording will be made available after this session, and I'm sure Jess will also be comfortable with sharing the slides in PDF form. I just want to answer that comment in the chat. Thanks so much, Jess. Do I need to repeat?
Yeah.
All right.
So it's a great question, and thank you for that. For me, it comes down again to international agencies working with local actors. If you remember, I was talking about how local actors have a better understanding of local culture and tradition. And I think this is where it is so important for us to make sure that there is that balance of working, of support of international actors supporting local actors. I think if I was to go into a community, and I mean, I can speak to South Africa and what I know of here. There are traditions and beliefs that I know if I was to challenge that, I would get huge flack for, and it is absolutely not my place to do that. But someone who is from the community and who has those lived experiences can communicate with communities at a much more equal level, if that makes sense. And so I think the best way for us to move forward in that space is really to make sure that we are collaborating with those locally led organizations, and that transformation of knowledge and learning, and balancing out, yes, there are going to be beliefs or traditions that are not true, but understanding where those come from. And I always just come back to respect, 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 respect. And it's not our place to come in and judge and say, but that's not true, even if scientifically it's not true. But if we work with local actors who understand that context, it might take a lot longer for those shifts and those changes to take place. But I think that is probably the most efficient and the most effective way for us to manage those sorts of situations.
Thank you so much, Jess. Apology, that was from Josie Milner Day. The next question we have is from Frances Hutz. She has a comment rolled up in a question. There is a strong perception that localization requires a huge amount of resources and time, which is often a limiting factor, particularly for government and other smaller organizations. This often discourages stakeholders from using a localization approach. Do you think that this perception is true?
I don't. I think it's a widely believed and to some extent accepted concern. But I personally don't think that it's true. I think if it is done right and it is planned from the get-go, that funding and resources can be channeled in a far more efficient way, and in a far more long-term and sustainable way. I also just think that if we're talking about expense, there is the stat on response, and I know that there have been updates to this, so I won't claim to know the latest numbers, but one of the stats that came out around the difference in cost of proactive versus reactive is that for every dollar spent on proactive activities is a $7 to $15 saving on reactive activities. And if we think about it in that context, right now, international organizations are in this perpetual response model. So they're taking money and you're responding. But if we were to take that and funnel it into a localization strategy and supporting local organizations, we're getting to a place where we're building resilience into the community so that when something happens, yes, disasters are going to happen. We're not going to stop that. But when something happens, the recovery is so much faster. And I think that is a really big mind shift that our entire space needs to make, and not just the mind shift, but actually the action behind it. But thank you. Love the question.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you so much for everyone's comments coming in. I am going to pick from them, and then I'm going to give anyone a chance who wants to actually turn on their mic and turn on their camera and perhaps comment or share or ask a question verbally that Jess can engage with and answer. I'm going to jump to Jerry Westerman's comment. Do resilient communities have to be place-based, or can it include other types of communities?
Now that is fascinating. I'm going to make some assumptions on what you mean by this. So please feel free to come back in the chat and clarify. But I'm going to assume that you're talking about, let's say, for example, a church community. And I don't think that it has to be place-based. I think we put a lot of emphasis on place-based, but I do think that the concept of resilience expands far beyond that. I think it comes down to the social structures. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the 7 capitals model. And so you're looking at built environment, you're looking at finance, you're looking at social, you're looking at cultural, and all of those different areas. I think communities don't necessarily need to be tied to a single geographic location, but I also don't think that because they're not tied to a geographical location, they can't be resilient. So I hope that answers the question. I think if you've got the right structures in place, it's really about the support and the network of individuals and kind of how you can rally together around a situation.
Thank you, Jess. That was a lovely answer. I'm going to take 2 more questions that have been put in the chat and in the Q&A function. So the next one is from Mike Devine, I believe. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. We live in a busy world and everyone's time is precious. How do we motivate communities to get involved?
Consistency and trust building. So working with the Langa community and with a lot of other communities, that's obviously the closest one to home right now. There's a pretty icky situation that happens where organizations come in or even researchers come in and they almost take from the community. So what can we get from you? And then they leave and they're gone. Or there are half promises made and they leave and they're gone. And communities, there's like this, almost want to say like a despondency. And people just like, well, what does it matter? If you're not going to follow through with me, why should I follow through with it? And so I think at the end of the day, if we're going to work in this space, we need to be consistent in what we do. We need to show up. We need to show up with integrity and play open cards and reassure that we're in it for the long haul. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Jess. I'm now going to take the last of the written comments. Please do keep adding your comments into the chat. I'm just going to cycle from answering the written comments or questions to giving certain people the chance to turn on your mic and your camera and ask or comment directly. So the last comment I'll take now, Jess, this is from Christopher Scott. Many examples today are as a result of a response to a major disaster. should we be doing more in terms of preparedness, and what might that look like?
Absolutely. So again, to go back to those stats I was quoting around funding, and again, I did see a comment in the chat around where did I get that from. I can also share the link, but I think someone has actually posted it, so thank you to whoever that was. But to go back to that, right now in our space, there is still an emphasis on response and recovery funding, on the reactivity. And I think from our side as practitioners and academics, there needs to be more of a push. There has to be more of a push to say, it's okay. It can't stop. Obviously, we still need funding for those things, but the emphasis has to stop. We have to start looking at proactivity. So mitigation and preparedness, and driving that as our primary vehicle for resilience building. It's why I've focused my research in the area that I have, because I really believe that when we get that right, the benefits are so significantly great, so much significant. Ooh, that's not English. End of the day, are much more significant than if we were to continue funding the response and the recovery side of things. So I don't have a this is what we should do answer, but what I can say is I think all of us need to play a role in driving in steering that ship in the direction of advocating for more funding being allocated to mitigation and preparedness. Because without it, we're going to continue sitting in the same boat year after year after year. And what we want to get to is a place where even if disaster events intensify, that the response times are continuing to decrease and that the recovery times are far shorter.
Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you so much, Jess. I'd now like to open the floor to anyone that has a comment or a question or a story to share. You might not have a question for Jess, but you may have an example that you wish to share with the rest of the participants in the room today. So I'd like to ask that you please raise your hand using the raise hand function on the top bar of Teams if you would like to share something verbally. I believe Andrew and myself can assist with turning on your mic and your camera. Great. I see Nisha Kaduska has their hand up. Andrew, can you assist with, I think I can allow.
Yes, I've just enabled the mic. Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
Hi. Firstly, Jess, absolutely amazing. Really timely for me. I'm writing my paper on Indigenous knowledge and nature-based solutions for flood risk management. And I'm slightly jumping on Brett's comment because actually this is something that I'm really looking at. And that's how in a country like the UK, do you actually get communities to engage? I went to a brilliant session the other night at my local council looking exactly flooding. 4 people turned up. There were more speakers than people. So how do we get them to be, if I can't have you at that meeting, how do I get them excited and passionate about trying to do something ahead of time?
Well, first of all, I'm really glad that it is timely for you. That's amazing, and yeah, all the best. I feel like I'm here with books at the moment. So it's a tricky one. It's really, really tricky to get people excited about it. I know for me though, what has really stood out is, I mean, when I first started in this space, if I said to people I work in disaster management, I'd get this like super confused, what, huh? And obviously, I mean, it's become a lot more well known with pandemics and all that stuff. But I think there just needs to be more education around what we're talking about. I really think that there needs to be a bigger push in the schooling system to talk more about disaster management and preparedness and all of these things. And there are great shifts that are happening, but I think it needs to start younger because, I mean, truth be told, I chose what I was going to study 2 weeks before I started because I'd never heard about it before. And so that for me is, I think, part of the cultural shift that needs to happen is bringing children and our youth into it far earlier. Obviously, there's layers to that, and we need to protect children as well to some extent. But I think a big part of it, and a big part of protecting children, is giving them the information that they need. And hopefully in doing that, it gets people a little bit more excited to be a part of it. There's the glamorized side of disaster management and like, oh, you worked in a hurricane. And like, yeah, there is that element to it. But the bigger part is people need to get that excited about what can we do in my community, with my community. So yeah, there's so many aspects to it, but I think that's a big one for me.
Thank you very much. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Nisha, and thank you for your answer, Jess. I see that Brett Hopcroft has his hand up. We will work on the technical side now.
Hi, Brett. You should be able to come on mic now.
Yeah, hi. Again, thanks for today. Just building on what has been said in that last question. In the developed world, how useful is social media, and how we, as a fire and rescue service ourselves, we're kind of great at pushing out cute messages of how we've rescued a dog or something, and people will engage with that. But if we try and engage with them with, this is how you actually prepare for wildfires or flooding, we're just struggling to get the community to actually take it on board. And I get what you said about that cultural shift and getting in there from a young age, and also that consistency and trust building. Yeah, I was really hoping for some quick fixes.
Me too, Brett. Unfortunately, I don't think that there's quick fixes. I think there are quicker fixes. But I mean, social media is a really tricky one. It's a deep, dark quagmire at the moment of misinformation as well. And I think there's also quite a lot of distrust with what is on social media. And I think there's also fatigue of people where information is put out. And I mean, if I use early warnings, for example, so an early warning will be sent out to some of our communities, and then nothing happens. And then people go, oh, okay, I prepared and nothing happened. And then an early warning goes out again. Okay, nothing happened again. And so I keep coming back to this thing of consistency, where I think we need to, first of all, there needs to be one source of truth on a matter, on a topic, and the messaging coming out on there needs to be consistent and not all over the place. We've been working with and you would have heard in Dom's intro, working with an organization called Beotree, which is primarily a data collection platform, but it's also designed to support communities in being a part of information sharing. And they've developed this notification suite that you can share notifications directly. You know that is the source of truth, and there's also a feedback loop in that. And so you can not only see, okay, yes, we sent the early warning out, but also, yes, it was received. And people start to trust that over time. And I think that's a big thing is building up the trust. Because if I open my Instagram or my Facebook, I mean, 50 to 60% of the videos are AI generated, and the rest of my friends are all using heavy filters. So I don't know what anyone looks like anymore. And so I think that there is that distrust there. And so it's a bit of building that. I know there was a bit of a all over answer, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, basically there's no quick fix.
No, is the summary on that one.
That's great, thank you.
Cool.
Great, thank you so much for that, Brett. Thanks, Jess. I think we have time for one more actual verbalized comment. So I'd like to open the floor to anyone who'd like to put their hand up, to turn on their mic and their camera and share a story or ask a question. If not, we will move back to the written comments. Last chance, anyone who'd like to turn on their mic and their camera and verbalize something. Great, we have a raised hand from Gabriel. We are just working on the technical side.
Hi, Gabriel, you should be able to come on the mic. I'll just enable your camera as well. Okay, go ahead. I think you have to unmute yourself at your end, Gabriel. Yes, we
Okay,
can
thank
see
you
now,
so
Gabriel.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I actually had put up a comment on the chat box. Basically, I'm trying to, I don't know, from your experience, working with government. I'm calling from Nigeria. I mean, I've been involved in community-led monitoring, promoting it, supporting it, and all of that. But it does appear to me it is essentially an initiative that is driven by donors, by partners. Government really will allow it because they are not putting resources into it. So I'm asking from your experience, do you think community-led initiative in disaster management has the support of government to the extent that government can provide some regulatory framework for maybe social contracting, for funding? Or, I mean, to what extent do you think a community-led initiative can survive on its own without the support of donors? I mean, I know the communities are willing, they have their own strengths, but many times they lack the infrastructure, they lack the funding to be able to drive a community-led initiative or response. So I would like to share your thoughts on it. To what extent is community-led response in disaster management having the support, funding of government and other institutions of government? Thank you.
Gabriel, thank you so much. It's such a good question, and it's such an important question. I don't think that globally there is enough support from government structures yet for community-led projects. I think it is a big shift that needs to happen. But again, I think because our global structures are still prioritizing response and recovery funding, there is less available, or they're saying there's less available for those proactive initiatives, and community-based initiatives for the most part should fall into the proactive part of the journey. So again, I want to come back to this funding issue where there needs to be a change in the mindset and the shift of where we're prioritizing our resources. It's not to say every government is like that, and there are governments that are funding community-led initiatives, but I think it is definitely in the minority, and it's something that we all need to be driving more, because, like I said before, otherwise we just get stuck in this cycle of every year the flood comes, every year the impact is the same, if not worse, and so there's a shift that needs to happen, and I think it's happening, but it's happening slowly at this point. Thank you.
Great. Gabriel, do you have any other comments there? Okay, great. I see your camera's off. Fantastic. Thank you for that.
I'm very grateful. Thanks for those for the feedbacks. I sincerely appreciate your thought on it. It's something that we need to work on because of the added value community-led responses and initiative in disaster management brings to bear. So we need to really create opportunity to build that trust between the government and beneficiaries, and all of us who are responding in that sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Okay, and I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up today's session. Thank you so much for being so engaged. Abdi, I see your hand is up. We are going to enable your mic now.
Hi, Abdi, that should be enabled. Yeah.
Yes, good evening, good everyone. I am from Somalia, so I just wanted to ask a question with my facilitators about in terms of the community leads. When we are doing now, I'm working as a local NGO as a program manager with partnership of the UNFAO in a Somali program. So sometimes you meet a community leaders always sometimes they are doing with the bias in terms of the selecting with the sustainable project. So how can we rectify with that areas? Since in an international NGO and UN's partnership, nowadays they are just focusing localizations and empowering with the local NGOs. Over to you. Thank you.
All right. Abdi, I just want to clarify your question. Would you mind just repeating it for me? Because I did miss that slightly.
Sorry. If you confused my question. So I said currently we are focusing on the sustainable project in a Somali program with partnership of UN FOA.
Okay.
FOO. So when we empowered with the community leaders in a Somali in a project, sometimes the community leaders they are doing with the bias in terms of the selecting with the beneficiaries or targeting areas. Always they are just driving the project target location with where the areas where they come from. So how can we rectify with that poor misleading?
Okay. All right. I think I hope I'm going to answer your question here. So this for me, and I mean, obviously you are based in Somalia, you're working there, and I think it is about that relationship journey with the community leaders that you are working with. As with a lot of the things that I've said, there are not quick fix solutions. And so I'm sorry about that. But I think it is about encouraging transparency. It's about sharing what the impacts of not being transparent about that are, and working with them to understand why is this happening, and then what those impacts could be. Again, respect, and also for me is communication. A lot of this, we love throwing big technical things at the problem and hoping something sticks to the wall. And most days, if we just go back to basic human principles of communication, trust, honesty, and listening, that we can find solutions to all of these things. So I know that that's not giving you a solution to that challenge right now, but I think it's really just about having those open lines of communication, having honest conversations to explain what this could do, and then why something has to change. I hope that answers your question.
Great. Thank you so much for that question, and thank you for your answer, Jess. We are now going to wrap up our wonderful session. Jess, thank you so much for being with us here today. And we'd also like to take a moment to once again thank everyone who was able to attend this session, whether in person now with us or after the fact, watching the recording. We know you're very busy, and we truly appreciate you coming to the table, adding your thoughts. The chat has been very busy with recommendations and comments, and a lot of engagement. So thank you so much for that. This is all about bringing together the international community so that different practitioners in slightly different fields are all contributing to the broader body of knowledge around societal resilience. I'm now going to share the slide deck again and hand over to Andrew, who has some exciting news to share.
Hi, Dom. Thank you very much. And yeah, really fantastic presentation, Jess, as well. And really great Q&A. So thanks for everyone for contributing. This is just a really very short kind of commercial break just before we wrap up the session. Obviously, many of the activities that that we're all engaged in over the year are online, but every year the National Consortium for Societal Resilience has an in-person conference in Manchester. So the fourth conference on societal resilience is taking place in February 2026 at the University of Manchester. And this is really just a flag up to you for those of you either in the UK or wishing to attend a conference and travel into the UK internationally. So it was really great that Jess mentioned earlier in one of her answers, the vital importance of children and young people. It just so happens that part of our conference focus will be around children, young people, families and intergenerational learning, but also then civil society, and really just focusing again on the kind of national UK, but also then the international conversation on societal resilience to disruption. So I have placed in the link a link in the chat to the conference webpage, and obviously you can find out more about it there. Dom, I wonder if you could possibly move on to the next slide. So I've noticed, and obviously Dom referenced it, some people asking about the recording of the presentation, the recording of today's webinar session. So you can see then on this slide, the web page where you will be able to find the recording. If not by the end of play tomorrow, then hopefully sometime next week. So not only will the recording of today's webinar be there, but the previous 25 to 30 or so webinars that the National Consortium and the International Consortium have been engaged in over the last number of years are all there for people to freely access. I placed in the chat earlier on the link to the INCSR LinkedIn page, so please connect if you haven't done so already. And then just a quick shout out to the RBOC network, who is also one of our partners in the webinar series. So thank you very much, Dom, and I will stop talking there and hand over to you for the final. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. That's it, folks. Thank you so much for making the time to be here today. We would just like to remind you once again to please follow that link, that LinkedIn link that Andrew has popped in the chat. That is on LinkedIn is where we post all of our reminders for upcoming webinars and events, and where we post some thought-provoking, prompts and questions and things. So please do get involved there on LinkedIn. And the final reminder before we let you go, before school is out, is to please use that email address we showed you in the beginning. Andrew will also pop it into the chat again now, to suggest any colleagues or community members or even yourself for sharing additional presentations similar to what Jess has just shared with us. We really are continually looking for as broad spectrum an approach as possible to these sessions, where we want to gather various different perspectives when it comes to societal resilience, and we want to give practitioners such as yourselves and projects the chance and the platform to speak out as to what they're doing and how we are all moving forward and progressing the field of societal resilience. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again very soon for the next event in December. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening or morning or afternoon.